handouts here. Danielle, can I recruit you? All right. Danielle's got handouts. Bibles are up here on the cart if you need a Bible.
No, we've got them. We've got them.
We have it,
And I
thank you.
took the new one too.
Oh, okay,
For next
so we're
week.
all set for next week.
Yes.
You got two?
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
Yes. Put on the back of the
Jim, can I give you a Bible? You got it. All right, hold on.
We could probably get one. Another one, sure.
There you go.
Thank you.
If anybody needs pencils, we have a little mug of them here.
Paper queen, I swear.
Thank you for that wonderful sermon today.
Thank you.
Preaching about demons, I mean, really, that's
Well, thank you. I always feel like when there's one of those passages that's confusing, it becomes like your duty to preach on that one.
right.
Because you can't read that one in the service and then just say nothing about it and go talk about something else. Yeah.
Look somewhere else.
Yeah. So fortunately, the other ones were fairly straightforward. So
So the idea of wanting to eliminate demons entirely is not a good one.
well, it's more that that's not the end goal. It's a good goal. It's just not the end goal. That when we eliminate, and if I'd had more time, I would have gotten more expensive about it. But even in our own habits, you know, the whole idea of like displacement, you know, you're trying to get rid of a bad habit, but if you just focus on getting rid of the bad habit, you're thinking about that all the time. You're just going to slip right back into it. So the whole idea of displacement, that you're going to replace it with a good habit, you know. So the idea, the goal isn't just cleaning house. It's a good goal, but to invite in then what should be there.
Kind of makes sense.
And that's where the word of God interruption actually kind of makes sense. And that's why Jesus, I think, never comes back to explain that.
There's
So,
comfort and, there's solace in those words.
yeah,
And knowing that, the goal is just to think about God.
right.
And never mind the demons.
And by
they'll
his
take care
word,
of
he
itself.
enters in. Exactly right. Yep. So handouts are here. Does anybody not have a handout? Alex doesn't have a handout. Here you go, sir.
Depends on what you're talking about, a handout.
And Bibles, does everybody within sight of a Bible? All right, very good.
Are these
Go
for the
ahead.
taking?
Those are for the taking.
Anybody else need one?
Thank you.
Anybody else need a Bible? Okay, we'll get rolling. Okay, so let's do a quick review where we're at in the Old Testament, what's been going on. Remember, we're using the covenant relationships that God formed with his people as sort of the chapters of the story of the Old Testament, at least the history of the Old Testament, and also to understand what God was accomplishing within that chapter. And so we're using those covenants being agreements, contracts. Testament is another translation, so you may have noticed in the liturgy of the sacraments, I'll alternate between saying this cup is the new covenant in my blood, or this cup is the new testament in my blood, because they are synonyms in that usage. So let's just do a quick review so we've got all the gray matter working. God created Adam and Eve. God created humans. Defines his relationship with them how? What were they supposed to do?
Make babies.
Make babies, that's right. Be fruitful and multiply. What were they not supposed to do? Not supposed to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They did make babies, they also ate from the tree. Not good. So they got cast out from the garden. The babies made babies, which made babies. The world became populous, but really also dug into the knowledge of good and particularly evil, so that just a few chapters later, God is lamenting that he's even created humans. Then he uses the flood to drown the unbelieving world, but saves believing Noah and his family, 8 souls in all. That's all part of the baptismal liturgy, by the way, that we use here. So God, after having wiped out the world, needs to, again, establish what the relationship is. So what's the command to Noah then? Make babies. That's right. But this time no prohibition connected with it. Just repopulate that earth. God chose to make it simpler. This covenant had a sign. Sometimes covenants do. What was God's sign? Yep, the rainbow. All right, so what you're going to say, Al? Yep, very good. So the rainbow is the sign of that covenant that God made with his people. Obviously used for a very different purpose now, but I would love for us to reclaim that particular symbol. I find it interesting that God's promise to never again destroy the world for its waywardness has become the symbol that it has to celebrate its waywardness. It's like, well, God still remembers that promise, so we call it the Noah flag in our house. So there are a lot of places that are big fans of Noah, apparently. But that every time we see it, we don't have to get angry about it. It's a reminder of God's patience with his wayward children.
You know the song, The Rainbow Connection?
The Rainbow Connection, yeah.
I want to connect it to Noah.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's make Noah the Rainbow Connection. I like it. Yeah, absolutely. Well, he's the original Rainbow Connection. And every time you see it, whatever else its connotations, it's a reminder God has promised not to destroy the world in that way again for its waywardness, even if it may itself also be a reminder of our waywardness. So we have the story of Noah. Then the next time that we really pick up with defining the relationship is when God selects Abram out of the middle of nowhere and tells him a number of things connected with the covenant with Abraham. Who can remember some of the various things? It's the most complicated one that we've seen, certainly more complicated than Noah got. Yeah, Jim.
You shall be the father of a multitude of nations.
Yep, so a great nation would be born through him. What else happened in that covenant?
The whole world will be blessed.
The whole world would be blessed through him. Yeah, and also kind of connected with that, those who bless him, God would bless. Those who curse him, God would curse. Yeah, two other things as well.
Descendants will be like stars.
Yeah, so then when God uses the imagery, he uses the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore of that great nation. Even though, remember, Abraham, as that story goes on, he starts out 75 with no kids. He ends up 100 still with no children through Sarah, even though they've kind of tried to work around by that point. So we have a great nation. We have all nations being blessed through him. Carol?
Will make your name great.
A great name as well, which is like, renown and an image. And then one other. It's going to become very important.
Paul makes the argument, seed, not seeds.
Oh yeah, his seed. Yeah, so we get the promise once again that through his seed, the whole world will be blessed. Not seeds, so that's a prefiguring of Christ. The same way we saw the prefiguring of Christ that the woman's offspring, singular, would crush the head. So at each point we're getting these prefigurings of Christ. The one other thing, it's going to become very important to where they live. The land. The promised land is promised to him at that time. But then we saw last week, we studied the life of Joseph. Remember, and it starts out and they're near the promised land, they're shepherding and so forth, and then Joseph gets sold into slavery where? Egypt. Has his travails there, but eventually rises to being basically in charge of the whole country. He's not the Pharaoh, but he's the one calling the shots. Pharaoh's got the power, but Joseph has the authority. And then, because of the 7 fat years in which they stored everything, and then the 7 lean years in which the whole world comes to them, not only is Joseph's family restored to him, but now all of the tribes of Israel, all 12 plus. Remember, there was the blessing of Joseph's 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh. But they all reside where now? In Egypt. Yep. And what's one thing that has been consistent throughout the story of God's people that they're supposed to do? Be fruitful and multiply. So there they are in Egypt, and what do you suppose they do? They're fruitful and multiply. They make babies. Lots and lots of babies. Now I have to give you a little bit of a background here before we get into the text itself, because there's too much in the story for us to be able to cover all of it, and we can't split up into teams like we've done in the previous couple of weeks, because we're going to need to walk our way through. Otherwise, nobody would pick the middle section with all 5 chapters. So we will. Congratulations. We're on session 7, and we're finally out of the first book of the Old Testament. We will not continue, as I warned, we will not continue at that pace. In fact, we're just about halfway through the survey. We're going to go at quite a bit different pace, because what's going to happen is a lot of these foundational teachings and understandings are going to start to rinse and repeat. But we got to get the people at least to the promised land before we can start to do that. So looking at Moses, I want to ask people, and this goes behind what was assigned, But what do you know about who Moses is? And then we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 3. But what do you know about who Moses is? And before we get there, what has transpired with the people of Israel? Yes, Carol.
They're now enslaved.
They're now enslaved. If you take a look in our Bibles, it's page 45 if you've got one of the Pew Bible style Bibles here. We've got some more up here if anybody would like. Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. Anybody want to read that for us? Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10. You've heard my voice a lot today. Alex has got it for us. Go ahead, sir.
8 through 10?
Yep.
Okay. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.
All right, so God had promised to Abraham that his children would become as numerous as the stars in the sky or the seas on the seashore. Well, that becomes rather threatening to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is concerned, well, if war breaks out against us, they outnumber us. If they join our enemies, we're done. And so Pharaoh deals shrewdly with them, setting taskmasters over them, afflicting them with heavy burdens. He basically enslaves them. It doesn't really dive into how exactly did he do that when they were outnumbered, but Israel, by the time we pick up with Moses' lives, are slaves, and they've been slaves for a while. And there's this interesting thing with the Hebrew midwives. You can go ahead and read that, etc. There's some fascinating stuff there. We're not going to be able to focus on it today. But then tell me about the birth and the young life of Moses. Who can remember some of those plot points? For starters, Pharaoh has a population control plan, doesn't he? And this obviously gets picked up again as a theme in the New Testament, both horrific actual historical events. What is Pharaoh's plan to control the population of the Israelites? Kill all the boys. Basically, we're going to hit pause on a whole generation of Hebrews. The females, you can let them live, but the boys are all going to die, which is inevitably going to create a gap in this reproductive cycle, which is going to be population control. When does that get repeated, by the way?
Plagues?
Well, Herod and we're going to come back, killing the boys, but King Herod wanting to kill all of the baby boys in Bethlehem because Jesus had been born. So some powerful imagery already before Moses is even quite born between Moses and Jesus as some parallels that we're going to see. Again, remember, a lot of the cash value of understanding the Old Testament is the way that it absolutely enriches what we see in the New Testament. It doesn't change what we see, but all of a sudden it has a different life, a different flavor to it, and sometimes a different urgency as well. So Pharaoh has said, time to kill all the Hebrew babies. Bad news for Moses, because Moses is a Hebrew baby. But interestingly enough, Moses is not a Hebrew name. Why? What's the workaround that Moses' mom figures out? Puts him in a basket covered with pitch, and puts the basket where? Into the river. So when they come looking for babies, no baby in her house, it's floating down a river. Now, right away, obviously, you can imagine as a parent what it's like to take an infant and consider it being placed in a basket covered with pitch as its best option, wherever the river happens to take it. Although God has already saved his offspring through a basket covered with pitch, just a much bigger one, as God preserved Noah and his family and all of the animals. So some powerful imagery there already getting repeated with the saving of Moses. But what step did Moses' mother take to try to provide care for Moses?
Well, Pharaoh's daughter found him.
Well, at first,
Am I getting ahead of the story?
just a little bit, one detail. How did she know that the Pharaoh's daughter found him rather than it just going on? She sends the daughter to follow along. So the Nile is not, at the place where they are, is not a rushing rapids. It's a big, wide, flowing river. Depending on what season it is with the flood, will determine how fast and exactly where the shoreline is. But if you're picturing Class 5 rapids, that's not what's going on here. It is a slowly flowing river. And so she sets her daughter's not at risk because there's no edict against the daughters, sends her daughter to follow along and see what becomes, if you can, of the basket. Now pick up there, Carol. So who finds the basket?
Pharaoh's daughter.
Pharaoh's daughter, so a princess of Egypt. Now we don't know if she's a crown princess or anything like that. In fact, probably not, because the lineage went through sons. We know that in Egypt. But Pharaoh's daughter, so she is a princess of Egypt, finds the basket and decides to do what?
Keep the baby.
Keep the baby, raise the baby, right? But she didn't give birth to a baby, right? So her body's not going to be producing milk right now. So what's the solution? Hire a wet nurse, right? A nursemaid. Who does she hire? Well, there's this little girl there who has an idea. I know a woman who's nursing right now. And who is the woman? Moses' own mother. So best of both worlds. He's raised as an Egyptian prince, his name being Moses, being drawn from the water. If you're familiar with like Akhmos or Tutmos, if you've ever studied Egyptian history, same root, Moses. Tutmos, Akhmos, so you can see there's some wonderful historical accuracy there, even in the naming. But she names him Moses because she's drawn him from the river, which interestingly enough is also a Hebrew term. There's an overlap between the languages there, which is really cool, that God used both to proclaim his message. Really kind of cool. So Moses is raised as a prince of Egypt, but nursed by a woman who is actually his Hebrew mother, who is a slave. We don't know, other than from the Cecil B. DeMille version, how much of this background Moses knew. Has he been taught that, hey, actually you're one of us, not one of them? Either way, he would have grown up familiar with both cultures, right? But when we pick up in Exodus chapter 3, Moses is out in the wilderness all by himself. Why? Why is Moses not in the palace as a prince of Egypt? He killed a man. One time he's out and he sees a taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and he kills the taskmaster and hides his body in the sand. And then interestingly enough, the next day he sees some Hebrew slaves fighting with each other. He says, hey guys, how about you knock it off? And they, not very wisely, taunt him by saying, what are you going to do, kill us like you killed the Egyptian? He's like, oh boy, news is out. Wasn't as secret as I thought. Now there are different understandings then of what happened next, because we got verse 15 of Exodus 2. I'm on page 46 now. When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. So it certainly sounds like Moses has run to avoid a conviction, right? As opposed to Cecil B. DeMille has it, as his punishment or as his sentence. So I'm afraid we're going to have to differ from Yul Brynner here and say that Moses was fleeing justice rather than having it visited on him. So now he's out in the wilderness. There's the wonderful thing of the drawing the water, and he rescues the girls, and then he meets his wife. Unfortunately, biblically, no evidence that he had ever met or freed her before. That's a nice little artistic license if you've ever seen the movie Prince of Egypt. It's not indicated in the text anywhere. And I want to pick up, I'm going to read verses 23 and 24 of Exodus 2, and then let's take some turns reading Exodus 3, 1 through 12. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. I love that verse. That's not one that ends up on greeting cards very often, but God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God knew what was going on. That might not have been a tremendous amount of comfort to the slaves at the time, but it should be. And it can be for us. God sees, God knows. But I love the very explicit reference here. God's remembering his covenant. He made a promise to Abraham that his people would be great. And it didn't just mean in number. That's why it becomes important his name would be great, right? If you have billions of offspring and they're all slaves, is that a great name? No, of course not. You do have a great nation, but they're all slaves. So now that name portion is like, well, why say both? It's not just the number. they're going to hold a position of renown. That's not slavery. So God is remembering his covenant with Abraham. So we carry on here. Now we get to read. We're just going to do verses, I said 1 through 12, but I actually want to do 1 through 15 of Exodus chapter 3. So anybody willing to at least start us off, read a handful of verses, and then we could potentially pass it off, or you can read all 1 through 15 if you want. Anybody like to be our reader? Christy, way in the back. Call it out for us. Chapter 3 of Exodus, we're on page 46. If you're using the Pew Bible, we're going 1 through 15.
Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take up your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations.
All right, fantastic. So real quick, we covered most of this in the recap, but the first question there, who's Moses? Why is he in the wilderness? Anybody want to give us just the very Cliff Notesy answer to that one? Who is he? Why is he in the wilderness?
Keeping his father-in-law's flock.
He's keeping his father-in-law's flock at this point. That's his occupation. His background, child of Hebrew slaves, raised by Egyptian kings, or princes and princesses at least, and in the desert because he committed murder, a murder from which he has now fled the potential death sentence. All right, so not necessarily the person you'd pick as the hero of your story, but certainly the one that God chose. Where are the Israelites and what are they doing? They're in Egypt and they're being slaves, which has become more and more onerous. So any idea that this is just some sort of pleasant servant relationship where Pharaoh provides the land and then they work the land, which it was originally, is long gone now. They are very, very clearly being, and intentionally being oppressed. The goal isn't just let's get as much work out of them as we can, and if they happen to die, they're expendable. The goal is to work them so hard that they are not a threat. That's different, right? If you're just trying to build pyramids and we're going to use whoever we can use, well, they might get stronger, they might get weaker, that doesn't matter as long as the pyramids get built. But now they're intentionally assigning them harder and harder work in order to keep them oppressed. That the work is why they will not be able to rebel. But their voices have been heard by God. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question on if they're working them so hard, but they've killed off an entire generation of males. So how is it that they're actually able to even do that?
It would seem their attempts to kill them off have not been very successful, right? Whether other people had the pitch-covered basket idea, or whether God's blessing of promising that these people will flourish can overcome even the slaughter of the newborn babies. Now the thing is, they didn't say kill everybody under the age of 50. They said kill all the babies. And it's a little hard to know exactly what the age cutoff would have been. But you're right. I mean, if they killed everybody under 50, that's it. There's not going to be any more Israelites. But if you kill 2 years worth of Israelites, then you're just kind of hitting pause, right? And then they'll resume. But not only have they resumed, but by the time that Pharaoh has died and the next Pharaoh, his son, is now Pharaoh, they're numerous again, that the problem has clearly not been solved. And partly, God's remembering his covenant with Abraham to make him a numerous nation, more than the stars in the sky or the sands on the shore. So we see that despite the brutality of what they were subjected to, it did not interrupt God's plan, did not overcome his intention, which is good to remember. So what does God promise to do? And I guess I kind of gave this away a little bit. What does this have to do with Abraham? What's God promising Moses? We got all the wonderful pyrotechnics of the burning bush. We're not going to ignore the symbolism, because when Abraham's covenant was made, how did God pass between the pieces of the animal that symbolized the forming of the covenant? God was personified, not as a person, but as fire. So here comes God again in fire. It makes sense. God is going to also, we're not going to have a chance to see much of it, God is going to rescue them, partly using fire, both in the plagues and then when they're wandering in the wilderness. So then thus fire is going to become important in the tabernacle and in the temple, and trickling its way right down to our candles in our sanctuary, as symbolizing God's presence among his people. So God comes down, and the burning bush that isn't, it's on fire, but it's not being consumed, which I think is wonderful in a lot of different ways. One of the neatest things I heard pointed out is God doesn't need any fuel for his fire, right? He can provide fire all by itself. He doesn't need his creation to provide him with the fuel. So while the bush is burning, the bush isn't really the fuel for the fire. It's more just the location, which certainly attracts Moses' attention. At first it'd be like, hey, there's a bush on fire. That's kind of interesting. But when you watch sheep, you've got time on your hands, right? So the next time you look, you're like, that doesn't look any smaller, right? I mean, we think of it as this momentary thing. Oh, there's a bush. It's not being consumed. Hark, I shall go, right? But he probably saw this for a while happening, right? You'd have to. How else would you realize that the bush wasn't being consumed? So you're thinking, what on earth does this mean? And rather than it being one of these overwhelming displays of God's authority, I love the way God just plants curiosity in Moses. I don't know what to draw from that, I just like it. That rather than this big thunderclap or hurricane or whatever, because God could have done any of those, and he does sometimes in his self-revelations, this is just this curiosity. What's going on with this bush that's not burning up? I'm gonna go check that out. And I don't know what Moses' plan was, because you can't really stick your hand in there, right? But I'm gonna go take a look. It's more fun than watching sheep, right? So I'll go take a look and see what's going on. He approaches God and all of the interaction that they have. But what we're gonna focus on for our purposes here is, what does God promise that he's going to do? He says, I've heard my people, I've heard their cry, I know the burdens that they're suffering under their taskmasters, and I'm gonna do what? I'll bring them out of Egypt. Bring them out of Egypt, and bring them where? To the land of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the stalactites and the stalagmites, and etc.
But to serve God on the mountain, which was the promise to Abraham.
Serve God on the mountain, the same mountain that he had promised, and this is the same land
Right.
that he had promised. For instance, Jebus was the name of Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem. So the Jebusites are the dwellers of Jerusalem. We just saw a Canaanite woman last week in our gospel passage. The northern part of what we think of now as Israel was Canaan. These are the people of the very same land that God had promised to Abraham. So I'm going to bring my people out from slavery. They'll worship on my holy mountain. Debate whether that's talking about the receiving of the law at Sinai. I think more likely the holy mount that ends up being in Jerusalem. That debate can go on, that's fine, that doesn't really affect us. But I'm going to bring them out, they'll worship on my holy mountain, and they're going to take hold of the promised land. So in one swipe, they're already a great nation numerically, but so far those who curse them seem to have been blessed. They certainly aren't a great name among the nations, and they've got no land. So of those 4 promises that we saw to Abraham, only one of them's really happening so far. But with one step, God's saying, I'm going to fulfill the other 3. And good news, Moses, it gets to be you who leads them. But does Moses think that this is good news? You want to go face to face with the most powerful man in the world and tell him to let go of all of his slaves? And by the way, there's family history here too. Right? You're going back as a convicted murderer who fled away from this man's father. Wait, when did the murder happen? I don't remember if it's the father or the son he's fleeing from. We could go back and check. But either way, they know who Moses is. He's a man with a history, and that history is not as God's prophet. Right? So that's who God calls. Moses throws all the objections up. We're not going to take a look at all those right now. I wish we had more time to. There's a lot you can see and discuss there. But Moses gives all the objections. God meets all the objections. He sends Moses back to Egypt. That itself is rocky in between his appearance before Pharaoh and how well he's received by the Israelites, because Pharaoh's pretty shrewd. And he says, all right, Israelites, you're going to send a man whom they hadn't sent, but you're going to send a man asking to be set free. Well, I'm going to make your work even harder then. So now I used to provide you with the straw for making the bricks, but now you've got to go get the straw for yourself. So your workload's basically been doubled. But I'm not going to lower the quota of what you need to produce. So basically everybody's pulling double shifts now. And if you're wondering who to thank for that, thank Moses, whom they then try to stone, right? Because this was not what they asked for. But God has promised deliverance multiple times. Now, what I want to do here is take a look at his deliverance, but just in a quick fashion. When we studied the book of Exodus, and this is probably going back 4 or 5 years now, we had a chance to pull this apart with more detail than we're going to be able to today. But what I want to do, just to be able to point out some interesting things here, is ask you to just scan through the headings and tell me what the different plagues are. And I'll make note of them up here on the board. So you can just kind of call them out one by one. What was the first plague? Yeah, and I'm going to be more specific, and I'm going to say Nile to blood. Okay. What do you got for the second plague? Frogs. And lest you think, oh, frogs are cute. They talk about frogs that were so numerous that they were in their beds and in their cooking pots and in their ovens. And of course, there's not enough food to sustain that many frogs. So what happens to the frogs? They die. How'd you like a house? I mean, frogs are cute. I'm not going to argue that. How'd you like a house full of dead frogs? Ugh. Yeah, right? Okay, so let's not wander into thinking this is kind of cute here. This is not cute. And I'm going to talk more about the significance in a minute. But what's plague number 3? Gnats. Now, I don't know. You might think frogs are cute. I don't think anybody thinks gnats are cute. All right, keep going. I heard 2 different ones. What's the 4th one? Flies. All right. Yeah. So after the gnats come the flies. By the way, it doesn't say what kind of flies. Even if it's just house flies, you'd have the problem of many, 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 many of them, which would not be pleasant. They might not just be house flies. What if they're biting flies? What if they're horse flies? Ooh. Okay, carry on though. What do we got for the 5th one?
Livestock died.
Livestock are dying. Though I have to point out now, at each point, important detail, all of these things are happening in Egypt proper. They're not happening, by the way, in Goshen, right across the river where all the Hebrews live. So clearly one neighborhood is taking a turn for the worse, while the other neighborhood is staying nice and neat and unaffected. All right, so which also rules out the idea that these are just a fortunate for the Israelites, not fortunate for the Egyptians series of circumstances, of happenstance, of good chance, because it's happening consistently to the Egyptians and not happening to the Israelites. What would you, by the way, we're only 5 plagues in, what would you wish you could do if you were an Egyptian at this point? Wouldn't you rather be an Israelite? Which is a huge difference from where you were a month ago when you were thanking your gods that you were an Egyptian, not an Israelite. Now you're starting to wish, man, I wish I could have been an Israelite. This stinks, being an Egyptian. Part of the point. We're going to talk about that. I wish we could live in Goshen. All right, what do we got for 6? Boils. Not exactly sure what the medical diagnosis for cause would have been, but it doesn't matter once they're there. No thank you. Boils all over the skin. All right, 7.
Hail.
Hail from the sky, which is of course going to destroy whatever might be left of the crops. Locusts. Well, there you go. Whatever didn't get squashed by hail, getting eaten up by locusts. Then darkness. And then the last one, the death of the firstborn son. Now with that last one, I'm going to talk about kind of what's happening overall here. But with that last one is important because while all of these are affecting only Egypt, by the time you get to darkness, that's going to affect everybody. And by the time we get to the death of the firstborn son, is that prescribed only against Egypt? No. That one, interestingly, is also going to visit the Israelites. Unless blood on the doors of the house. So I'm going to put firstborn son death, but I'm going to put / Passover. Because if you spread blood, and by the way, what kind of blood? The blood of a lamb, properly slaughtered at the proper age, and that lamb is then going to be consumed by the family, so everybody's getting a feast. Obviously, eating a lamb is not something that the impoverished would do very often. So they get a feast. The blood of the lamb is spread on the entrance of the doorway, and when the angel of death sees the blood on the doorposts and across the lintel, he will pass over the house. Now, it is almost impossible to overestimate how significant this is for what happens in the New Testament. But before we do that, I want to look at some of the other stuff. So, does anybody know why these various things? I'm going to hand you the easiest one. Obviously, God's just trying to wear down Pharaoh and the Egyptians, right? The same way that Pharaoh tried to turn the Israelites against Moses by making their situation worse, God says, well, actually, two can play that game, except I'm a pro and you're an amateur, right? So that's part of it, right? God is simply opposing Pharaoh and bringing Pharaoh about to doing what God... By the way, for a while it says Pharaoh, hardened his heart. Like each time it happens, it's like Pharaoh's like, okay, I'll relent, but then Pharaoh hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens his heart. Partway through, it starts to be God hardening Pharaoh's heart, which can seem pretty harsh. But if we had more time to talk about it, eventually it's God saying, you picked this course. This course is going to run all of its way now. You don't get to change course now. You had lots of options. You had lots of opportunities. Those opportunities have gotten spent. So, well, it still is God, and we have to approach him with proper amount of awe and respect. It's also understandable. At first glance, God hardened Pharaoh's heart and then punished him for it? That doesn't sound right. Well, it only comes after Pharaoh hardened his heart over and over and over again that God says, nope, now it goes the whole way. You don't get a different option at this point. Yeah, Danielle.
It also doesn't say at any point, Pharaoh wished he could change, but God said no.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, well, we do have, when Pharaoh's will is referred to, it's always referred to as Pharaoh doesn't want to follow God's will. And then eventually, God doesn't even leave him the option, essentially. But you're correct, we don't get any verses that say Pharaoh wanted to change his mind, but God said no, because we're going to see even after the plagues, Pharaoh changes his mind again. What else, though? Christy, you had a hand up.
Well, you were asking about the
Yep.
10 plagues. Aren't they all different representations of the Egyptian gods?
Correct. So, I mentioned the Nile. The Nile is the life, this is still true. The Nile is the life of Egypt. It floods once a year, and while you would think of flooding as being a bad thing, they had this amazing complex system of canals and stuff. The flooding was actually extremely necessary to their crops and the well-being of they had papyrus, they had all kinds of things. So they needed the Nile to flood, and one of their daily offerings was an offering to the god of the Nile, which sort of is the Nile, if you get into their mythology, sort of. But so that's where God starts. He's going to take their lifeblood, speaking figuratively, and actually turn it into blood, which is not ideal for raising crops, right? And so God systematically then, from that point forward, it's kind of fun, and we did this when we did the larger study. You can go through and you can see that every one of these things, like there was a God whose job was to watch over the livestock. there was another god who took on the image of a fly, right? And interesting, we heard about the Lord of the Flies today, depending on exactly what you do translationally with Beelzebub and Beelzebul, and whether those are two different names or not. But Beelzebub is Lord of the Flies, which you've heard before. But so there was an Egyptian god that looked like a frog, and there were gods of all of these various things. Then at various times in Egypt's gods and in their history, Ra was the sun god, right? So systematically what God is doing is showing, I'm stronger than all of your so-called gods. And this becomes very important, and I didn't have time to dive into it with the sermon today, but when you understand the way that things worked in the ancient Near East, even to some degree up until Jesus' time, there was the idea that every people had their god, or perhaps a couple of gods, and you were going to prosper if your god was more successful than the other god. It's sort of like a patron god, right? And if your god does better, then, and this shows up a bunch of times in the Old Testament in a bunch of events that we really aren't going to get to touch on in the survey. But Beelzebul, if it was supposed to be the same as Beelzebub, which is one of the positions, then Beelzebub was the god of the Philistine city of Ekron. So each city had their own kind of god. We see this in the New Testament when they're in Ephesus and they're offended because their god is Artemis. And here come the apostles preaching about Jesus being the only true God, and there's a riot. They try to kill them because you can't talk bad about our goddess. And the reason being, if you talk bad about our goddess, then our neighbors are going to attack us if they don't think that she's powerful enough to defend us. So Egypt had their gods. It's partly what's called animism, which is the belief that there's a god of the sun and a god of the rain and a god of the livestock and a god of the this, and you try to appease the various gods of the various things. It's partly that. It's also partly all the various civilizations that got amalgamated into the Egyptian empire, and so rather than have a big, battle royale between the various gods, they kind of adopted a pantheon of gods, and there would be priests of this and priests of that. Depending on who you listened to, the most important gods were either the one responsible for making sure that the Nile watered the land, or Ra, who was the god of the sun, or Anubis, who was the god of death. Right? So these were the biggest ones, and God is systematically our God, the one true God, the one who has given his name to Moses. I didn't touch on that, but Yahweh is traced back to that phrase of I am that which I am. Yahweh has changed a little bit in terms of orthographically the spelling, but it basically is I am, is what Yahweh means. And so I am being the God. That's why it's so powerful when Jesus says before Abraham was, who's the son of the covenant, I am, he's claiming to be the name of God. He's saying, I am God by name. That's a pretty big deal, particularly for the Pharisees. So, this is God warfare. Spiritual warfare in the truest sense. This is God taking on all of Egypt's gods and showing they don't stand a chance compared to me. Systematically dismantling their entire belief system. At the same time, turning Pharaoh's people against Pharaoh, and at the same time, because the Israelites aren't having to go through it, making the Israelites the most distasteful thing in the nation. If we could just get rid of them, maybe we could turn things around, right? So you see how incredibly strategic this is on every possible level. On a psychological level, on a practical level, on a spiritual level. God is dismantling every weapon that would be formed against him. Which is really cool. Now, the Passover. We said we're going to spread the blood of what? A lamb. Where? On the doorways of the house, so that what will happen? The angel of death will pass over, and so that the firstborn son will be preserved, right? And when does Jesus get crucified? On Passover. And Jesus has been called by his own cousin, John the Baptist, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And it's by his blood, which we later will then receive in communion, that the angel of death will pass over, not just the firstborn sons, but all of us, because God's only begotten son was not passed over. but was in fact the blood. Look at all the incredible layers. And we'd probably spend a whole hour, if not more, just taking apart all the unbelievable layers of meaning there between the Passover and what Christ was going to bring to fulfillment, which itself, the Passover, is a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, right? 3/4 of that promise potentially at this point being fulfilled because of God bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. So look at how much meaning and purpose there is to all of this that's going on, which, by the way, would have been totally hidden from your average Hebrew slave at the time, right? Would it have been easy as a slave to feel like this is all purposeless suffering? Was it purposeless? And you can go sit with Mama. Oh, beautiful, bud. I love this. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Look at this. What he's made. Yeah, I love it, pal. Thank you. If you're a Hebrew slave, it's easy to think, boy, this is just pointless, purposeless suffering, generation after generation. Was it pointless, purposeless suffering? It was not. Suffering, yes. Pointless and purposeless? Most certainly not. Danielle and then Dave.
Is there any indication in this text or others that they were actually still being observant in Egypt
Of
Hebrew tradition?
So the challenge here is observant, and I'm actually kind of leading you with that. Observant of what? Because what we don't have yet is any clear instructions for what they would observe.
But had they forgotten, like had they, in the generations that they'd been in Egypt, had they forgotten all of the tradition and custom? Because it struck me as weird this time that Moses has to say, who am I gonna tell them you are?
Right.
Have they like nothing?
Well, and that's the thing. We've done a pretty deep dive on Genesis, right? I mean, we didn't leave a whole lot unturned, and what we did I made reference to, like Sodom and Gomorrah or Tower of Babel or stuff. Where at this point have they been laid out what it means to be God's people? How they know who he is? So it's a wonderful leading question, $20 coming your way later, because he's not just proving all this to the Egyptians. To whom else is he proving all of this? To the Israelites who have lived in there for all those generations, for whom it could be reasonable to think, I wish I was an Egyptian because their gods actually take care of them, right? And we got this God who promised this dude years ago, and what's that doing for me lately, right? So it's not just him. And that's where the question becomes a very astute one, but an interesting one. Observant of what? They haven't been given any instructions yet. In fact, the only priest that's been referred to yet, we had to skip this, is named Melchizedek and makes offerings to Yahweh on behalf of Abraham, but is not of Abraham's family. So he just kind of comes almost literally out of the blue, and that's why later the New Testament can pick up that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. He's not following the lineage. He's a priest because he's a priest. He's a priest because of his faithfulness. But interestingly enough, this is very much a define the relationship moment, not just for the Egyptians, but for the Israelites. They're learning who God is, and talk about a shock and awe campaign here to show who their God is. All of a sudden, this God that they didn't even know his name has proven A, he exists, and B, it's good to have him on your side. Like really, really, really good. And it may have taken a long time, but holy cow, is he demonstrating his power now. Actually, holy cow doesn't come till later. That's later in the story. Dave.
Question regarding the 10 plagues.
Yep.
Any context over how many years that would have endured? They would have endured that?
So it's no is the short answer. It'll just keep saying afterwards or but the Lord did this or that sort of thing. However, I think what we have to do is conclude that it's quicker rather than longer. Some of them do say the duration, others do not, but time's going by. So I think if this was like a 10-year span, two things would have happened. One, Egypt would have been wiped out forever, right? I mean, even the Israelites at some point wouldn't have had food. So I'm inclined to think this is a much more compressed time frame, because obviously otherwise the Egyptians are just going to start raiding the Israelites, right? And that's not going to turn out well either. Although there would be a healthy fear of doing anything to the Israelites at this point, since they're clearly being spared and Egypt is clearly being afflicted.
Right.
So no is the short answer. The longer answer is no, but it's probably a pretty short period of time that we're talking about. However, it may have taken, say, a season, right? And maybe how it's possible that we get a couple of times that they say all the crops were ruined. Well, maybe your spring crops got ruined, so now the summer crops become that much more important.
Right.
The summer crops get ruined. Well, maybe we'll get something out of the fall at least. Fall crops get, so maybe did this take a growing season? Could it have taken a year? Possibly, but probably not 10 or 20. Yeah. Al, what you got?
Just an observation.
Yep.
Piggybacking off of what Dan said.
Yep.
Exodus number 7, verse 25.
Yep.
Says 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck them out. So
Yep.
there is some.
Yeah, every once in a while we get a little bit of time indicators, and they're always in the shorter kind of span. Yep. So,
For the rest of them, how long?
yeah. Some of them give us sometimes, like I feel like, and I honestly didn't get a chance to reread this. Did it say how long? Yeah, that's what I thought. In fact, wonderful little foreshadowing here. Quite literally, how long was it dark in Egypt? 3 days. Literally foreshadowing. How long was Christ in the grave? How long was the light of the world hidden? So some powerful, powerful stuff that I think would have been much more. Because keep in mind, this is how the nation of Israel came out of slavery. And we in America are still, for good and for ill, wrestling with the legacy of slavery and then deliverance from slavery. And that's an incredibly seminal moment, incredibly forming moment for people groups, right? And so this is what God's going to keep going back to throughout the Old Testament. He's going to keep saying, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt. And this story of rescue from Egypt is such a powerful people culture shaping moment that anything that is an echo of the Passover event or the rescue from Egypt that happens in the New Testament, we have to kind of dig and say, oh, hey, maybe it was that. They would not have had to dig. They would not have had to say, oh, maybe it was. It would have been an association as strong as if you see an evergreen tree with lights and ornaments on it. You don't have to wonder, hey, could that have something to do with Christmas? Right? I mean, it's so steeped in the culture, it's immediate, right? I might have even just been able to say, if you see an evergreen tree, it might remind you of Christmas, right? So keep in mind that when God picks up these themes in the New Testament, for us, we got to dig. We got to do the work to get back into the culture and to embody it. Well, they already were embodying the culture, and these connotations would have been unbelievably strong. That's why Jesus says before Abraham was, I am, and they immediately pick up stones. They don't need to have, hey, you know what, we should have a committee to evaluate whether he was trying to claim. It's obvious to them. It's just, a big flashing neon light to them. That's why it's worth doing. Okay, so the Passover, why it's important. What's the result after the Passover? What does Pharaoh finally decide? Let them go. Get rid of these people. Right? And so we see finally, verse 31 of Exodus chapter 12. It's page 54. Pharaoh is the subject here for verse 31. Page 54, chapter 12, verse 31. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron by night and says, up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go. Serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone. And bless me also. This is a total turnaround, because originally their request was just, can we go worship our God out in the desert? That was all they wanted. He wouldn't grant that. Now it's just go and be gone and take everything that belongs to you, and please say a good word for me on your way out. Right?
Had enough.
Yeah, I've had enough. Yeah, this is a total surrender. This is without condition, without terms, just flat out surrender, which is what God had warned would be the results. So then we see the next section here is the Exodus, the institution of the Passover. It becomes their highest, holiest meal, understandably why. Consecration of the firstborn, some other feasts here. The pillar of cloud and of fire. It's how God's going to lead all these people who have never been anywhere else except Moses. And even then, he's just one guy wandering. By day, it's going to be a pillar of cloud. By night, a pillar of fire. Right? That's how he's going to guide this huge group of people. All you got to do is walk toward it. Right? Not a whole lot of coordination necessary. You don't need GPS. You don't need a lot of orientation skills. If you see a pillar of cloud, walk toward it. If you see a pillar of fire, walk toward it. That's it. Just walk toward where God says he's going to be. You can see why cloud and fire continued to then. That's why incense was ever part of the worship, right? And still sometimes is. And fire is still part of the worship. All right, so we got that going on. Then we get to the story of the Red Sea. Now we're 12:15 right now, and I'm going to assume that you're fairly familiar what happened at the Red Sea. For starters, they could have built boats or rafts or tried to find a way around, except there's some urgency at this point. Why is there urgency when they get to the edge of the Red Sea, Al?
Pharaoh changes mind.
Pharaoh's coming. He changed his mind, and he has this thing called the chariot army, right? So they can ride on their chariots. They can move much faster than a group of slaves on foot, right? So they're going to pursue them, and they're going to right this wrong. And at this point, righting the wrong doesn't mean bringing them back. This is a take no prisoners, this is a kill them all moment. So now they're trapped. They've got Pharaoh's army, the strongest army in the world still, pursuing them by horse. Short-lived freedom of theirs is coming to an end. And then the Lord, so he's brought them, and by the way, it's also interesting, if you read the place names, some archaeologists have said, well, this can't be right. They're just kind of throwing place names up there. But actually, if you read the place names and trace as far as we can tell where they went, God brings them out of Egypt. I've had the map here, it'll be a little easier, and he kind of makes them bounce around. They're not really making any progress. So you can sort of understand Pharaoh's mindset a little bit, because I'm sure he's got somebody keeping an eye on where are they. They're here, there, they don't know what they're doing. They don't have a plan. They don't know where to go. They're sitting ducks. And meanwhile, we're here completely devastated, but I still got an army. Even if I lost every firstborn, the seconds and the thirds and the fourths are all here. We still have time to correct this. So to me personally, I find those place notes not as reason to question the narrative, but actually a sign of perhaps it's still a little caginess on God's part. Did Pharaoh get lured a little bit here? Perhaps, but he made his own choice. So they're pursuing them, but they're stuck at the edge of the sea. So what does God tell Moses to do?
Receive the staff.
Yep, it's verse 15. I'm on page 56. Firstly, I should say this. Let's back up a little bit, because this is some of the only chance we're going to get to see some of this. This dynamic between the people and Moses and God, this kind of three-way relationship here.
Excuse me, can I just
Yep.
ask a quick question? How
Yep.
many people is Moses leading out of Egypt? I probably said it somewhere and I missed
I
it.
don't remember if they've given us the
600,000.
number.
It was
Yeah,
a huge
600,000.
number,
Yeah,
right?
and
Okay,
the,
huge.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people.
the challenge is this, and I'll just say,
Yeah.
figuring out how to handle numerics in the Old Testament is a little bit tricky, because we can't be 100% sure that they're using numbers the same way that we did. Most of the reasons for a census and that sort of thing was to muster forces for the military. And there's some pretty good linguistic evidence to say that the word for 1,000, which is Eleph, is also equally well translated as regiment, which is kind of interesting, because in U.S. history, when we had wars that required volunteer units, like regiments for, say, the Civil War, a regiment was 1,000 men. But it was 1,000 men when the war started. Some regiments came home as fewer than 200 men, but they're still a regiment. So does the language mean 1,000 mathematically, the way that we would for addition and subtraction, or does the language mean a unit of people? Because people have pointed out, if it's 600,000 people, it'd take like 3 days for all of them just to walk past a single point. The logistics don't work.
No boats.
So are they just playing with the numbers here? Well, maybe, but maybe what they mean is there were a sufficient number of people to raise 600 regiments of soldiers. Now that's still a large group, and the logistics need to be figured out, but it's a little bit different from 600,000, and it doesn't require questioning the historicity of the text at all, or whether it's accurate at all. So I always say, with the big numbers in the Old Testament, and someone said, hey, it was just an estimate, but even then that would introduce some level of doubt. I say, well, hold off, because we're not part of that culture. They would have understood exactly what was meant by the language, and we don't quite always, because there's
From a
enough.
practical standpoint, any large group of people moving en
Yeah.
masse it's gonna be difficult to
Absolutely.
traverse the river.
It's still a huge crew, and the logistics are gonna become a huge part of this story. How do you move and feed a group of this size? Whatever the exact number is. Is it 600 regiments? Is it 600,000? Is it somewhere in between? I think we don't have to undermine our confidence in the text to say it's some huge number of people, right? But if you start to do the math and say, well, it couldn't be more than 599,000 because X, Y, Z, it's like, all right, chill out a little bit with the literalism on the, we don't,
Irrelevant, really.
we don't know if they meant exactly by it what we would assume they meant by it. So
That's helpful, thank you.
that's an excellent question. So this little dynamic here, and then I'll bring this to a close for today. But I'm looking at 14 verse 10 on page 56. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. That's a good sign, right? I mean, he just did all these plagues, right? So at least they're crying out to the right, the envelope's been sent to the correct address. And they say to Moses, here's where we go a little amiss. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. I do not remember you mentioning that. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Did they forget already? Now my heart goes out to them. They're in a panic. They're not an army. They're being pursued by the best trained army in the world. As far as they can tell, their next few breaths will be their last few breaths, and they're a little bit salty about it. I understand. But look how quickly, when our circumstances change, do we turn on God? Is there any logical reason to believe that this problem is bigger than God can handle? Not anymore. But of course, how easily do we default to our human understanding? And they turn on Moses. Get used to this if you want to read the rest of the history of Israel's wanderings in the desert. Because as soon as things go bad, all of God's history of provision goes out the window, and it's just accusations. It's going to happen over and over. In fact, get used to it if you want to read the rest of the Old Testament. Get used to it if you want to understand human history. Get used to it if you want to understand, frankly, ourselves. Right? So you get all the elements there, though. It's part of why we can skip so much of what's going to happen over the rest of their Exodus, because here it is. God does something miraculous. The people say God's great. Then they're threatened by something. The people say we don't like God anymore. Right? And by the way, we don't like you anymore either, Moses.
Like parent and child.
Yep. Now look at Moses' response. I love this. He hasn't heard anything from God yet. Moses, at least, is a few steps ahead of the people in this process. Moses says to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to be silent. And please exercise that right to be silent. Right? Then the Lord says to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians. They shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Then the angel of the Lord, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was the cloud and the darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Moses stretches out his hand. I mean, it's almost hard to stop reading at this point, right? I mean, you don't want me to stop. This is as exciting as it gets. I have to stop. Time-wise, go ahead and read it on your own. But what you see here is the incredible power of our Lord. Some have tried to say Red Sea is a mistranslation. By the way, they're probably not wrong. Red Sea is probably more correctly translated as Reed Sea, Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds. However, remember, the Nile floods once a year. So even if much of the year this would be a very low body of water, it could be a very high body of water, and the right climate conditions have created that before, even not allowing for God's miraculous work. But there's an old joke There's a kid reading the Bible, and a modern scholar comes along. You may have heard this before. A modern scholar comes along, and the kid's saying, wow. And the scholar says, what are you saying wow about? He said, God made a whole sea part so the Israelites could cross it. God is amazing. The scholar says, well, actually, son, it's a mistranslation. It was a sea of reeds. It probably wasn't that big a body of water. A big enough wind would dry it so they could kind of slop their way through, and it's really not that big a deal. And the boy's like, oh, wow, thanks for explaining that to me. And as the man, the scholar starts to walk off, he hears the boy say, wow, God is amazing. So he comes back. He's like, didn't I just explain? He's like, no, look, the whole army drowned in just a few inches of water. This is a miracle no matter which way you try to slice it, right? So because God parts the sea for the Israelites, he blocks the way with the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. It's both the guide and the guard, which is so cool, right? Once there's a trough of water, even the Israelites can't get lost, right? You're not going to turn to the left or to the right. So go on through. I got the rear guard now. God's covering that up. But as soon as they get through, the pillar evaporates, and Pharaoh, in his last act of folly, sends the whole army charging in. The sea closes back in, and his promise that the army that you see today, you shall never see again. And we see God's incredible display. Yes, Alex.
And now that he's done that, he's
Yep.
wasted a lot of that. Now,
Yep.
how is he going to populate the earth? Because he just killed a generation of...
Yeah, so you've got Pharaoh. I mean, Egypt is in rough shape here. And this is also one of the interesting things, too, and it'll be kind of where we'll end here, is a lot of scholars have chosen to, for reasons other than just translational issues, kind of poo-poo this, disregard it. Because what they say is, well, we can't find any records of this in the Egyptian record. Say that again? You think Egypt is going to be eager to record these events? And if they do make a record of these events, you think they're going to be honest about what happened? Because Pharaoh just got wasted by a bunch of his own slaves. And by some god, no-name god out there, all of his gods got destroyed. This is one of the, I know it's kind of the last resort of conspiracy theorists too, but this is one of the cases where the fact that there's no other historical evidence would seem to prove it rather than disprove it. Because Egypt was the only world power at this time, and they're sure not putting this in their records. So even if you found any hints that would seem to, and there are plenty of hints, I'm not going to go into all of those, there are plenty of hints to indicate that there was a very numerous group from not Egypt. Different words get applied, but very tellingly, one of them where they transliterated, I can't get into all that, but they transliterated it into their own language as close as they could get to a different language, and the people are called the Hapiru. That sounds a lot like Hebrew to me, and I don't think that's by chance. However, we get some hints. To me, hints are enough. For a story like this, hints are enough of an external record. What I will grant is there are some challenges with actually dating it. We're not 100% sure where to date it and who was king at the time, and we know the name of Seti and Ramses because obviously the conclusions they made for the movie version concluded it must have been at this time. There's some powerful arguments the other way. I'm not really worried about that. I'm convinced that it happened, and that it happening proves who God is and what he's all about. And in the process now is at least setting things in the direction of filling the rest of the covenant, which is exactly what started us, that God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and decided within himself to set the people free and to fulfill that, and that Moses would be the tool. So then by next week, we're going to see the next stage of God's covenants with his people, as he now has a new people heading towards the promised land. They are now great, not just in size, but in name and in blessing. Unfortunately, we're also going to see how well they handle that. So for next week, which I have up here if you want to read ahead, although honestly I don't know if this sheet will be as helpful to you or not, because we're going to use it as a chance to review the Ten Commandments, the easiest summary of that covenant that God was making with his people. So you can feel free to take it if you want and make some notes and make some questions and so forth. Next week we will be reviewing the Ten Commandments and God's covenant with his people through Moses as we get to the fourth major chapter in the history of God's people. Adam kind of renewed then with Noah, and then the covenant with Abraham, and now into the covenant with Moses. All right, very good. Thanks so much for your time. It's 12:30. Let me say a word of prayer to close us up. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for the gift of your word, which drives out fear and even demons, and which is your means to deliver us your salvation. And so we thank you for the chance to gather around your word with brothers and sisters willing to do the same, both this morning in worship, now in deeper study of some passages. And we pray that as that word has been planted, that it would grow and bear fruit. It would accomplish that for which you have sent it. As we go forth from this place, we trust that you, by your word, go with us. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely week.
Thank you.
So Tuesday.
Yep.
I mean, I know we're supposed to have weather. I'll be here at some point on Tuesday, probably.
how it goes.
We'll see.
Or if
But I
not, really,
noticed.
I'll look at them tomorrow, too.
Okay,
I'm planning to look at them tomorrow morning.
okay.
So
So,
if you want, I can text you and let you know if you want to try swinging by before weather even comes. Totally up to you. But
yeah.
I'll text you when it's ready.
Text
Yes,
me
sir.
when it is. Good.
I like the,
And what is this? Is this a purse?
This is
A wallet. I love it. I'm going to leave it here to let the glue dry, okay? I love it. Thank you so much, Paul.
it's still one.
Oh, let's turn it off. Press the X right up here. See that X? Press that. And press End.